It's really great to be here this evening. Thank you so much for the invitation. I won't introduce myself. I'm going to be talking a little bit for the next few minutes about how we might take some practical steps to encourage greater racial diversity in our leadership of our churches. Now, I've got a lot of experience of being on leadership teams of different forms within church spaces. And thinking about the question of how we increase diversity in our leadership teams, I thought it would be helpful to share my perspective as the person who often feels like I embody the diversity, because I've grown accustomed to being the only person who looks like me in the room around a leadership table. And I realise in those moments in which I'm in those spaces that I see things a little differently, that I bring my own worldview, my own hopes and dreams, my own perspectives, politically, socially, and culturally. As a leader, I bring my perspectives as a mother, as a Nigerian-born Londoner, a woman, a black African woman, a person who feels 100% British and 100% Nigerian. But I've experienced that my difference can sometimes be otherized. As an ethnic minority on a leadership team, I have a particular experience. But we as leaders of churches and Christian organisations need to recognise the importance of ensuring our leadership teams are diverse, but recognising that the particular experiences of ethnic minorities within our midst might be different from our own. Sometimes it's hard to recognise that actually the world is tipped towards whiteness. Whiteness is in so many spaces held up as supreme. It is the norm. It's superior. And white superiority doesn't just come in the Klansman's cape or in outright, blatant, obvious racism, but in the way the world is structured, in who we see as holding the power in most places around the world. I want to tell you a story. Exactly a year ago, my family and I were in Nigeria for my grandmother's funeral. And the whole family gathered together from all over the world for 3 days of funeral, including 1,000 people at the main event on the Saturday. My family decided that we would combine the celebrations with a dedication of our 2-year-old son, Kia. We wanted it to be something hopeful on which to end the occasion. And so it was that my husband and I found ourselves dancing up the aisle with around 50 relatives, plus goats and yams and wads full of cash. Now, the Methodist minister at the end of the aisle said he felt particularly blessed that day because our son was the first child the new ministers had dedicated in this church. And they were even more blessed because the child was an Oyibo, which is a white person, and that a white man, my husband, Mark, was there. And the whole congregation whooped and cheered. And I realised in that moment that Mark's experience of being an ethnic minority is very, very different from mine. What this showed me was that even in those spaces in the middle of rural Nigeria, he is seen as being the one with the power because he is white. Now, what can we take from that about what it tells us about what leadership looks like in our churches or in our spaces? Who is it that holds the power? Who is it that keeps the power? Who might be able to share the power? I want to make a few points that might help us think practically about how representative or diverse the leadership or the leadership teams or bodies of our churches are. Now, the first thing I want to say is that diversity in our leadership teams is a good thing. It's not just about political correctness. Diverse teams are actually better teams because they bring together different perspectives that strengthen the whole. And I think that the church would benefit from breaking out of the groupthink that makes us elevate whiteness and often maleness in our leadership and in our teams. I came across this fact recently in researching my upcoming book. I found that immigrants are twice as likely to become entrepreneurs as the general population. And they bring with them what writer Matthew Syed describes as an outsider perspective. A 2017 study found that 43% of companies in the Fortune 500 were founded or co-founded by first or second generation immigrants. Similarly, according to a 2016 study of the US-based researchers awarded 65% of Nobel Prizes in the decades prior, more than half of them had been born abroad. Immigrants are much more likely to have successful businesses that survive longer, according to the Harvard Business Review. Now, what Matthew Syed says about this is that the success of this outsider perspective is because of the creative thinking that comes with belonging to two different cultures, an ability to see things from a different perspective and see change and innovation as possible. For Syed, the strongest teams are the most diverse teams, bringing together those who are able to see things from different perspectives. And he says this: think how comforting it is to be surrounded by people who think in the same way, who mirror our perspectives, who confirm our prejudices. It makes us feel smarter. It validates our worldview. And these dangers are as ancient as mankind itself. I'm particularly struck today by that quote, having had 2 hours sleep because I've been watching the US election, and the kind of shattering of what you think the world is or what you think the world should be, and recognizing that other people see the world differently. Now, mainstream churches in Western societies or all over the world are replete with leaders that surround themselves with people who think like them. White superiority has been able to persist within churches in these spaces because of a lack of openness to diversity within leadership, within the church. I think there might have been a lack of genuine interest in sharing power with those who are not considered as conforming to a narrow definition of what church leadership looks like. I'm sure many of you know Dr. Elizabeth Henry, who was at the Church of England, and on her departure from the church, she said, "I believe there is a willingness in principle, but not in practice, to tackle racism, increase representation, and genuinely work to achieve a greater sense of belonging for UK minority ethnic people in church and society." And she said that sadly, progress is painfully slow on this. I also want to say that the best kind of diversity is like a melting pot. So I think good diversity looks a little bit like Deptford, where I go to church. I'm part of the Bear Church there. Now, I've lived around Deptford for quite a lot of my life. And as many of you will probably know, Deptford is a melting pot of cultures, if ever I saw one. You've got Cockney butchers next to halal butchers. You've got Nigerian hairdressers being visited by Southeast Asians, sharing food at lunchtimes. This, to me, is a true picture of the multicultural, diverse Britain that I love. Now, what does this type of melting pot look like in our churches, all the way from our congregations to our leadership teams? I often think that perhaps it looks like the day of Pentecost when that day came. I love how Acts 2 says that they were all together in one place. Lots of different people in one place. I said earlier that we need to recognize that diversity is a good thing, but I also want us to recognize that diversity is a God thing. The church, I think, needs to be more open to a mosaic-like image of its congregations and its leadership teams, rather than one in which the colours of the pieces obviously match. I think the beauty comes in the chaos and sometimes the discomfort of difference. I think this tapestry of difference demonstrates the diversity of the kingdom of God. The picture painted of the early church is one of messiness, of culture clashes, and different people of different backgrounds coming together to create something entirely new. And yet this random group of people united around something that was bigger than themselves to create something countercultural. But sadly, I think that rather than the all-in-one place picture painted of the community of believers in the New Testament, a lot of churches today seem to sit on the opposite end of the spectrum. Most Christians in the UK go to churches where the majority of people are of the same racial background as them, leaving Sunday morning seeing churches split along racial lines. And for most of us, this is very different to how we spend the rest of our weeks, at school or at work. And I wonder what God would think of these monochrome churches with their monochrome leadership. In 2013, while I was working at the Evangelical Alliance, I was involved in the setting up of the One People Commission, which, if you don't know, is a group that aimed to break down the barriers between these different churches of different races. Although the forerunner, the African Caribbean Evangelical Alliance, ACA, had provided a much needed and vital space for Black Christians within evangelicalism, to me, the separation seemed to underscore the racial barriers that existed within British Christianity. Now, when the former ACA director, Joel Edwards, became the general director of the Evangelical Alliance, it seemed like it was a turning point because he was a Black leader leading a not Black thing. And soon after Steve Clifford took over as general director in 2010, he was convinced, as a white man, of the need to break down the barriers between races, between leadership of churches, following an Evangelical Alliance council meeting in which Black church leaders shared the pain of their experiences within white majority spaces. Bishop Wilton Powell, the Church of God of Prophecy, and Pastor Agu Iruku of RCCG challenged the council to push for unity that was not mono-ethnic. And so Steve, my former boss, responded. And so the One People Commission was born with a commitment to celebrating diversity and promoting unity. Now, it's not perfect, but this body is a unique place in which leaders intentionally aim to break down barriers between races. Sometimes it is messy, and people betray their prejudices and resort to lazy stereotypes. Sometimes the dominant voices are those of the white men. And here there is a challenge, a gentle provocation to reassess how we view others and consider through whose lens the world is viewed. Now, Steve, when he was reflecting on the journey of the One People Commission, shared this. He said, "I wouldn't be being honest if I didn't admit that it's been a challenging journey at times. As I started building relationships with many of my brothers and sisters in Christ who are from different ethnic backgrounds to myself, things were graciously pointed out to me which I'd been blind to before. In spending time chatting over coffees and teas, pizzas and curries, and probably jollof rice, I was brought face to face with my own patterns of behaviour, which I realised had in fact been damaging the unity that I thought I'd been promoting." And he said, "I've had to be willing to be made uncomfortable, facing up to the realities of what's really happening in my own life and in the wider UK church, and recognising the work which still needs to be done." Now, I think these changes are urgent and important. I think this year has taught us that more than anything. But I also think that it's not easy. But I believe if we're intentional about making our leadership of our churches more diverse, we can create a place of homecoming for all. I want to leave you with just a few final thoughts and reflections. I want us to reflect on what do we mean by leadership. When we think of leaders, we often think of men, and we often think of white men. But I think we have to expand our images of what leadership looks like and where it can be found. What does leadership look like in our churches, aside from the kind of main leadership of the church? How do we think about what our choirs or our worship bands look like? Or who it is that's up the front? Who's saying the prayers? Who's giving the notices? Who is it that we quote in our sermons? How can we work a little bit harder to make sure that the people that we quote, the theologians that we quote, are representative, that aren't coming from one single worldview? I also want to say that we shouldn't wait for people to volunteer. Sometimes it's really hard to put yourself forward, especially if you don't necessarily look like the archetypal church leader. So I think as church leaders, we need to be active in looking out at our congregations and inviting people to play their part in leadership. I also think that we need to work hard to combat the stereotypes we hold about people and to let people tell their own stories about who they are. In my career working within Christian charities, I've been surprised at the number of times people have asked me things like, Chine, what do Black majority churches think about X? The assumption being that since I am Black, I go to a Black church, that the church divides along racial lines. I also think that we need to, as leaders, make sure that people in our leadership are, I've come up with a phrase, diversity literate, that they don't create division unintentionally by saying things that might be upsetting to people who are from Black and minority ethnic backgrounds or non-white groups. I often think about when I was young, when I was a child, when we'd moved from Nigeria when I was 4, a family of 5 who were African immigrants turning up at churches in Southeast London or Hertfordshire or Kent in the 80s. I remember one particular visit where we went to a Baptist church in Hertfordshire. We arrived and the person greeting us at the door said, "Oh, welcome. Oh, what made you choose this church rather than the Black church down the road?" And I'm sure that she didn't mean it, but I have not forgotten it. We have to remember that no matter how diverse our spaces become, we have to ensure that we're genuinely and authentically open to difference. Because diversity is a fact, but inclusion is a choice. Thank you.